Assalamu alaikum. In this video, we will discuss the classification of hemolytic anemias. Okay, hemolytic anemias are basically divided into two types. Number one, we have intrinsic hemolytic anemias, and then we have extrinsic hemolytic anemias. The word intrinsic or intracorpuscular means that the cause of hemolytic anemia is present inside the red blood cell. And the word extrinsic and extracorpuscular means that the cause of hemolytic anemia is present outside the red blood cell. One point should be kept in mind here, that these intrinsic or intracorpuscular and extrinsic or extracorpuscular should not be mixed with intravascular or extravascular hemolysis, because the word intravascular and extravascular means that the hemolysis is taken place inside the blood vessels or outside the blood vessels, and the word intrinsic means that the cause of hemolysis is present inside the RBC, and the word extrinsic means that the cause of hemolysis is present outside the RBC. So hemolytic anemias are basically of two types, intrinsic and extrinsic. Then intrinsic hemolytic anemias are further can be due to inherited causes or due to acquired causes. Now, what are the inherited causes of intrinsic hemolytic anemias? Okay, there may be defect in the enzyme in the membrane of the red blood cells. There may be defect in the enzymes of the red blood cells, or there may be defect in the hemoglobin synthesis inside the red blood cells. Okay. Okay. What are the okay? So in the inherited causes, we have membrane defects, there can be enzyme defects, or there can be hemoglobin synthesis defects. Now, what are the membrane defects of the red blood cells? We have discussed in our previous video then that in the membrane of the red blood cells we have two types of proteins. We have horizontal proteins and we have vertical proteins. We have named the horizontal proteins as spectrins and we have named the vertical proteins as enchirins. There are also ectrins. So, if there is defect in the vertical proteins or ectrins, then the shape of the red blood cells changes and they become spherocytes, they become spherical. So, one of the membrane defects is hereditary spherocytosis. Then we have hereditary elliptocytosis, which occurs if there is defect in the spectrins or in the horizontal proteins. We will discuss all these defects one by one in our next videos. Okay, so we have covered the membrane defects. Now, what are the enzyme defects present inside the red blood cells? Enzyme defects can occur in the red blood cells in two pathways. Number one, there can be defective enzymes of the glycolysis pathway, or there may be defective enzymes of the hexose monophosphate shunt pathway. Now, in the glycolysis pathway, there can be defective hexokinase, or there can be deficiency of hexokinase, or there may be pyruvate kinase deficiency. This hexokinase is responsible for the conversion of glucose into glucose 6-phosphate in the RBCs, and pyruvate kinase is responsible for the conversion of phosphoenol pyruvate to pyruvate in the red blood cells. Then, what are the enzymes which are defective in hexose monophosphate pathway, shunt pathway? There can be defect or deficiency of glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase enzyme or glutathione synthesis, glutathione synthetase. Now, what are the hemoglobin synthesis defects? In hemoglobin synthesis defects, there are defective hemoglobin chains. Now, there can be qualitative defect of the hemoglobin or quantitative defect. When there is quantitative defect, then it means that the person is suffering from thalassemia and hemoglobin is not produced enough. If there is qualitative defect, it means that the chains are not formed properly. So, the example of qualitative defect is sickle cell anemia. So these are all the inherited causes of intrinsic or intracorpuscular hemolytic anemias. Now, what is the acquired cause? Among the acquired cause, we have paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. We will discuss proximal nocturnal hemoglobinuria in our next lecture. Okay. Now, what are the extrinsic causes? What are the extrinsic or extracorpuscular causes of hemolytic anemias? The extrinsic causes of hemolytic anemias are divided into two types. They can be non-immune mediated extrinsic hemolytic anemia, or they can be immune mediated. Now, what are the non-immune mediated causes? There can be mechanical trauma to the red blood cells. Whenever there is mechanical trauma to the red blood cells, then the red blood cells are broken down into small pieces which are known as triangular cells or helmet cells or schistocytes. Now, when the RBCs are broken down by the mechanical trauma, then there can be macroangiopathic hemolytic anemia or microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. The word macroangiopathic means that the RBCs are broken down in the large vessels, and microangiopathic means that the RBCs are broken down by mechanical trauma in small blood vessels. So, there are different causes of macroangiopathic and microangiopathic hemolytic anemias. So, what are the causes of macroangiopathic? There can be defect in the cardiac valves. When there is a defect in the cardiac valves and RBCs hit these valves, then RBCs are destroyed. Then there can be calcific aortic stenosis, which is the most important cause of macroangiopathic hemolytic anemia. Then there can be March hemoglobin urea. March hemoglobin urea basically occurs in soldiers. When soldiers march, then their feet again and again hit on the ground. So the RBCs which are present in the blood vessels of these feet are broken down and undergo hemolysis. As there is intravascular hemolysis of the red blood cells, so hemoglobin appears in the urine and the person will suffer from March hemoglobin urea. So it is a type of macroangiopathic hemolytic anemia. Then we have bongo drummer. Bongo drummer means that the persons who beat the drum, hit their hand on the drum again and again, and the RBCs present in the vessels of hand undergo hemolysis. So this is bongo drummer. Then what are the microangiopathic causes? There can be disseminated intravascular coagulation. Disseminated intravascular coagulation, there is damage to the endothelial cells of the small blood vessels, and when endothelial cells are damaged, then there is activation of fibrin and a lot of fibrin strands are formed. So the microcirculation become narrow, and when RBCs pass through these fibrin strands, then they are broken down. Then we have thrombocytopenic purpura, in which a lot of platelet thrombi are formed, and the microcirculation again become narrow, and when RBCs pass through this microcirculation, they are broken down. Then we have hemolytic uremic syndrome. Hemolytic uremic syndrome basically occurs in E. coli infection, and there is also a lot of platelet thrombi formed, and there is narrowing of the microvasculature, and when RBCs pass through these narrow capillaries, they are broken down. So this is all about the mechanical trauma to the red blood cells. Then there can be infections such as malaria or clostridial infection, which can cause non-immune mediated damage to the red blood cells. Then there can be chemical injuries, for example by lead, and all those conditions in which there is splenomegaly, then it means that there is some breakdown to the RBC. So these are all the reasons by which are actually the non-immune mediated causes of the extrinsic hemolytic anemia. Now, what are the immune mediated causes of extrinsic hemolytic anemia? When there is immune mediated damage to the red blood cells, then it can be either due to autoantibodies or due to isoantibodies. Now, what are the isoantibodies and autoantibodies? Isoantibodies are actually antibodies which are formed against the antigens which are not present normally in our blood. For example, ABU incompatibility and RH incompatibility. Because in both these conditions, our antibodies are formed against antigens which are of donor's antigens, not of recipient. So antibodies are basically formed against the antigens which are not present normally in our body, but they are coming from outside. Next we have autoantibodies. Autoantibodies are basically antibodies which are formed against the antigens which are present normally in our body, and autoantibodies are formed against them because these antigens are somehow altered. For example, there may be autoimmune hemolytic anemia, in which autoantibodies are formed against our red blood cell membrane, and red blood cells undergo hemolysis. Then there can be certain infections by certain microbes which alter the antigens of RBC surface, and antibodies are formed against them. Then there can be lymphomas. These lymphomas also produce antigens which are shed from the cancer cells, and due to these antigens the RBCs are altered. Then there are certain drugs which also cause alterations of the antigens of red blood cells. So these are all the causes of immune mediated causes of extrinsic hemolytic anemias. In our next videos, we will discuss all these causes one by one.